Thanks, Leo. Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Andy.
Good
Um,
afternoon, Marla.
I am just going to take a couple of minutes to set this up by introducing you, although I have a feeling you're pretty well known, and then I want to transition to our conversation about your new book, Moving. So let me just say a few things about you. You are speaking to us today from Ottawa, I believe, where you
Hmm.
are now visiting professor at the University of Ottawa. And you hold visiting professorships and have held them in a number of places around the world, including Boston College, where you were formerly on the faculty, Hong Kong University, and several others. We were going to learn a little bit more about this, but you come from a little northern mill town in England. I think it's called Accrington, if I pronounce that correctly, and have some very interesting stories to share with us about those origins. We know you, of course, as a teacher and a scholar and a researcher. I think I first ran into you during your work at the International Center for Educational Change at
Hmm.
Boise. Going back some ways, you have received almost every award I can think of in education, and as I said, have been a visiting professor almost literally around the world. I recall that one of those awards and honors that you won was a residency at the Bellagio Center, which is a
Hmm.
very cool thing to do, that I was once upon a time involved in. And you have been awarded the highest honors of many different organizations, and as well as honorary doctorates. And once upon a time, not so long ago, was named by Education Week, one of our favorite education journals in the US, or education newspapers of record, as being among the top 10 scholars with the most influence on US educational policy debate. You have won awards for your writing as well as research. You are the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Professional Capital and Community. You were the founding editor-in-chief of Journal of Educational Change. And you have authored, co-authored, or edited more than 30 books. The most recent, up until the one we're going to talk about shortly, was Collaborative Professionalism. It's one of my favorites. And I
Hmm.
do remember once joking with my former colleagues at the Annenberg Institute that there were days when I felt that Andy writes more books than I read. And I still have not been completely shaken from that notion. So your research, writing, speaking, consulting, and advice have taken you literally all over the world, from the World Bank and UNESCO to the Wise Foundation, the European Union, and on and on. I have had the pleasure of working with you, getting into some trouble together in at least a few different incarnations, from
Hmm.
my time at the Rockefeller Foundation, when you were an advisor to us at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform, and now at AFT. So it is a real privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. And much as I have enjoyed many of your other books, Targeted at the Profession, Targeted Teachers, Targeted Effective Strategies, the very notion of the profession itself, this book that we're about to talk about, Moving, a memoir of education and social mobility, is very different because it is just that. It's a memoir. And there is so much that we can take from it. I really enjoyed reading the book. So many insights into what shaped you as the educator and public figure that you are, your own personal experiences, with what we now called adverse childhood experiences. We didn't have the term back when you were experiencing them, with the impact of things like testing and tracking. So many things that we can take from your life into your work and into the situation that we find ourselves in with public education in our society. But I really want to get us started with you framing the 3 or 4 things that you most want readers and our audience today to take away from your memoir. What would you like to most share?
Thanks, Marla, for that fantastic introduction, which I think it's probably time to go now, because it looks like there's a lot of things been ratcheted up there. This apart from just wanting people to enjoy the book as a piece of literature. So it's written as literature that people might enjoy if it was about any life or anybody. Apart from that, it's really about three things. The first is the relationship between equality or equity, not quite the same, but equality or equity on the one hand, and something we call social mobility on the other, that is just surfacing now in the US at this election as being something of considerable importance. Um, Equality and equity, and I think we're fairly familiar with that. We strive for greater equity in our schools. We try to narrow achievement gaps, reduce the differences between different groups by race, by class, by culture, by language, and so on. I think we know we can't have complete equity. There's very, very few places in the world that have complete equity, but what we want is certainly more equity than we have in a country that isn't just about richer and poorer, but it's about filthy rich and dirt poor. It's really extreme inequity. And and alongside that is another idea actually invented by a Russian exile in America in 1929 called Petrim Sorokin. And he invented a concept of social mobility. He was exiled from communist Russia. And he basically, his view was, okay, there is inequality, but what would it look like if we had a lot of movement up and down? So there are differences, but it's fair and open in terms of your chances of moving up by ability. We sometimes call this meritocracy. And so this idea of social mobility and this idea of equality, they're related, but they're not the same. And they're often advanced by different kinds of people. So people who tend towards center right tend to favor social mobility, saying, look, we got inequality, we're quite happy with that, but we want it to be fair. And people center left and further left are really much more interested in equality as the driving force. And I think what this book shows through the narrative and through the research I quote at the time I was being raised and now is that although we think social mobility and equity are alternatives or different ways of addressing the same issue, actually it becomes clear as you go through the book that social mobility is not an alternative to equity, but it's the consequence of equity. So if you don't have much equity, you're not going to get much social mobility. And indeed, the more inequity we have, which has grown in the last 40 years, the less social mobility that we've got. And we can also see this when we compare different countries. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is really what is this a narrative of, and who is it about? And it is, of course, a narrative about growing up in a working class community and striving and struggling for opportunity despite obstacles in the neighborhood, in the culture, and obstacles at school. But it's not a sort of reality TV spectacle of a narrative. It's really a narrative that is the narrative of the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and the millions, not like Tara Westover's Educated or J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, where when you read it, you think, how on earth did they survive this and get to where they went to? So I think this is hopefully an experience that resonates with many people who struggle, who strive, who have given things up, uh, who've taken on extra jobs, who've left behind a homeland, um, and whether that's a narrative of class or race or immigration or LGBT, it's a narrative that resonates with lots of people who've written to me who, if you looked at them, would really not look like me in any respect at all. So that's really the second thing that the book is about. When you read it, many teachers have come up from modest beginnings, I think. Many teachers today have struggled at some point in their life and education. And if they haven't, and if they have, many of the children that they teach come from families with those kinds of struggles. So I'm hoping, in a way, it's a book that resonates for those people, and that doesn't divide different kinds of struggles against one another. Say, Black Lives Matter against the white working class, but really tries to bring together, understanding the differences, also uniting people around the importance of the ideas of struggle and opportunity and equity. And I think the third thing is there's more and more literature now we're finding about the amount of social mobility we have compared to 40 years ago, when it really started to go into reverse, when the Reagan years started and economic inequality grew. And as economic inequality grew, for all kinds of reasons, the chances of social mobility decreased. So, Bob Putnam's Our Kids, I think, is a very good example of how to explain that. And it's really more about the experience of mobility. So instead of doing studies, of which we have many, of kids who didn't succeed because of immense disadvantage, marginalization, oppression, because of the race or the socioeconomic position and so on. This is actually a narrative of people who do succeed despite the obstacles, but it's not heroic. It's not a heroic narrative at all. It's really a narrative of what the experience of that looks like, and all the way through, what the pressures are like, and the pulls to take you away from your culture of origin in order to be accepted into a culture of educational and academic success. So much of my narrative and the millions of people like me is about the push and pull of these cultures, and of your own struggle to move on up, as Curtis Mayfield said a long time ago in his song, without leaving behind the people who raised you, and indeed the identity of who you are.
Terrific. Thanks for that insight. And absolutely those themes of sort of leaving to then belong and to advance. The notion that it's in many ways a universal story with a different set of particular experiences.
Yeah.
And I do want to come back into a little more of the personal and the particularities of your experience, but I want to follow for a minute this trail of what you talked about in terms of, kids who were born in the 70s and 80s had a very different access and opportunity because of the factors that you started to talk about in UK and US, certainly in both of those countries. And as you near the end of the book and you think about looking forward, you talk some about the notion of economic democracy, as Wilkinson and Pickett put it forward. And that, things that go beyond just addressing, though, these issues of economic inequality and inequity, to things like, of course, robust public institutions, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about how you see that concept playing out and what that makes you think about the future of the things we should do. So, spoiler alert. You don't think
Okay.
that market-based solutions are a real good idea. You don't think that unpaid labor in the form of internships is a good
Hmm.
idea. If you could talk a little bit about what that, if we were to embrace that, what would that mean?
Sure, sure. Thanks, Marla. I think that since the 1970s, two things have, well, lots of things have happened, but two things in particular have happened. One is, in general, schools have got better at addressing issues of inequity, of looking at the well-being of young people as well as looking at their academic achievement. They've got more focused and more targeted around literacy. We know more about how to help people succeed. We know things about expectations and growth mindsets. We've learned how to deal with people's assets and not only compensate for their deficits. We've got to grips, not perfectly, but with things like a culture responsive teaching that knows how to, in curriculum materials and in the way we do them, how to engage with young people. We're developing more slowly concepts of wraparound schools or expanded learning time.
Mhm.
Things that actually engage with the lives of young people as well as with their academic learning. So oddly, schools within their power have got better, but we know that on average, only about 20% of the prediction of what will happen to a student and their success is attributable to what happens in schools. Some schools can do better than that, some schools not as well as that. But on average, about 80% occurs in relation to other things that David Berliner, Diane Ravitch, Linda Darling Hammond, and many other people have written very well about. And so what we've seen as schools have got better is that society's actually got worse over the last 40 years. Everybody now can rhyme off how much of America's wealth the 1% owns and how much indeed the 0.1% owns. Everybody knows that some of the biggest corporations pay zero taxes, and they have personal wealth that equates with the GDP of entire countries. And so something has happened over the last 40 years or so. And I think in the last 10, 15 years, we've got much better at dealing with what I would call cultural issues of inequity. There are also issues of poverty. We've got much better at dealing with issues of race or language, LGBTQ, special educational needs. We've got much better at addressing these things, gender equity and so on, at least in the rhetoric of public
Mhm.
life. What's dropped off the radar for a while is economic inequality, which relates, of course, to issues of we think of them as social class. Now, I grew up in a country where you can't move or cough without thinking in terms of social class. The UK, my country of upbringing, but I think in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been some phenomenal literature coming out by economists, and indeed largely female economists. One example would be Heather Boushey, who is Joe Biden's economic advisor. But there are a number of others, and some men as well, like Robert Reich, who are saying there's, as well as identity differences, there are some uniting narratives about economic inequality that we really need to pay attention to. And indeed, some of the consequences of these economic inequalities and poverty are what divide us in many other ways, in addition to racism, prejudice, and so on. And so we really have to start paying attention at a societal level to that. We have to start thinking, and more of the public are ready to entertain this now, that if we want good public services, including public education, actually we need to pay more taxes. And we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, Republican governors starting to, as well as Democrats, starting to levy more taxes in order to pay for public education, teacher salaries, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, you do get what you pay for, and you don't get what you don't pay for. And paying attention to this at the level of the whole society is desperately important. Um, and then there are institutional and organizational questions, I think, as well. So access to higher education, that is considerably less expensive than it is now. One of the functions of debt, by the way, is not just because universities are greedy, but it is because lots of the financial sector thrives off debt and gains great profit off other people's debt. So we've got the whole of the financial sector that has an interest in keeping high costs in university and high debt, because that fuels the financial sector. So the attack on debt is of course in favor of our students and young people who are most disadvantaged, but it is also a way of addressing those mega inequities at the same time. And I think the third thing I'd say is that there's what the economists talk about is not only that austerity is a bad thing, but that growth is a bad thing. Growth just for its own sake. So the obsession with growth has led to tax cuts and to cutbacks in the public sector. And what all these economists say is actually, if you invest in the public sector, it does, first of all, it creates better public life, better opportunity for young people, for everyone who benefits from the public sector. In addition to that, it also creates income for people that then moves into consumerism, and it actually grows the economy rather than shrinking the economy. Even the International Monetary Fund is thinking this way now. And thirdly, if you invest in the public sector, it's jobs. And and many people who are upwardly mobile, their first jobs are not in finance or in law because they don't even know what those professions look like. They are in public sector jobs, like teaching or social work or housing, and and those public sector jobs are less likely to depend on nepotism and more likely to depend on raw achievement than are jobs in the private sector. So economic democracy is obviously about equalizing somewhat, wealth and releasing funds for the public sector. But investing in the public sector also directly and indirectly creates more social mobility.
Thanks for that, Andy. And certainly as we have been not only at AFT, where some of my colleagues have worked on this issue, but certainly among progressive research organizations and economic organizations have looked at just what happened since in the Great Recession and its aftermath, and the
Yeah,
states that did make those public
yeah.
sector investments saw quicker economic recovery, so their jobs return more quickly, et cetera. So we have that evidence. It doesn't mean we were very good at acting on it, because you might have noticed that we're having a little trouble with Congress and the Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, actually
Mm-hmm.
moving something to alleviate the terrible impact on state and local revenues, which enable other things to happen, right? The kind
Mm-hmm.
that we've just been talking about. But I want to say that I think in your answer to that question, it seemed to me a bit more hopeful than I might have thought it would be. I don't know if that's congenital optimism or what factor is, and I noted that you said specifically that you think we're doing better by some measures
Mm,
on things like how we deal with some of the cultural issues of
mm,
inequity, LGBTQ youth,
mm,
for example. Um, but one thing that's also, so I'd like you to reflect on that a bit, that's certainly come to the fore um, this summer, and in all of the taking to the streets in such a wonderful way that happened after the murder of George Floyd, is that this realization of institutional systemic racism, and
mm.
how that becomes that much more challenging to address the equity issues, whether economic or cultural. And so just kind of wondering what you're thinking about that as you observe that.
Yeah.
It's been going on this
Um, I think one of the most important experiences in my life was moving to the United States in 2002 for 15 years. So I have spent equally 3/3 of my working life in three different countries: the country of my upbringing, the country where my family settled, which is Canada, that we've now come back to because this is where our grandchildren are. And 15 years happily actually in the United States. And of course, I'd always known we're not stupid about the importance of race and the history of slavery and oppression within the United States. And I've been in the US a couple of years. And one of my colleagues, Dennis Shirley, who I've written books with, was going on sabbatical. And he said, Andy, would you teach my curriculum course for me while I'm away? And I said, sure, no problem, Dennis. But I didn't really pay that much attention. And when I picked up the curriculum, it was the history of the American curriculum. And I just arrived. So I thought, what am I to do? So I decided that I would teach the course exactly as he had set it, and through that I would learn about the history of the American curriculum. And a number of the readings were by African American scholars, and of course about African American issues, and increasingly about Latino issues and other areas of diversity as well. And so for the first time, I began to feel in my bones what this was like for Black Americans, for all Americans of color, and and for all Americans who empathized with and were connected to the struggle of Americans of color. And that overlaps with countries of my upbringing. We struggled against apartheid in South Africa and the UK when I grew up. Recently, there have been big stories back in the UK of journalists, athletes being pulled over and manhandled, usually manhandled by law enforcement for apparently no other reason than the fact that they're black people driving nice cars. And this is something that I will never experience. I do have all my grandchildren are multiracial. Both my children moved into multiracial marriages. They're not black, but we still see microaggressions, and so we feel some of this viscerally. They're Asian Canadian, and and so I feel it in my bones in a way that I know. I know. I know that white privilege is more than an abstraction, and whatever I've dealt with and grown up with doesn't subtract from that in any sense whatsoever. Lots of that, not all of it, also intersects with, this is Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality,
Mm-hmm.
intersects with socioeconomic oppression and inequality, with poverty. So if it was a Venn diagram, it would look, I'm trying to do it now, but it would, there'd be a huge overlap between poverty and race, and there'd still be wealthy Black and Latino people who would experience racism. And there'd still be many people, many of the white working class who would experience oppression and disadvantage who were not Black. But there's a massive overlap between the two in the middle. My concern is that it's not fully been articulated in that way, even amongst Democrats for quite some time. And in that sense, it has, and we know the narrative, it's marginalized, silenced, uh, left out the white working class, feeling that nobody is speaking to them. And I understand why all this has happened. And we began to call the working class, not even the white working class, the middle class. So then this meant that the working class were actually people who weren't working. There were people in poverty. And there's somebody phoning home there, so I'm just going to put it off. I can't put it off, so you'll just have to put up with it for a minute. And therefore, in a strange way, if you associated white working class with poverty, it was the only identity you had to leave behind in order to move up. You could be gay and move up, you could be Black and move up, and you could still be proud to maintain the culture that you came from. And we know that there are those in your country, in the United States, and all over, who will stoke those divisions and try to get people to think only about race or other aspects of serious inequality, as if they have nothing to do with economic inequality, and in that sense manage to push to one side. And I think in a way, what I'm trying to do through the book, implicitly, even though I grew up in a almost wholly white working class community, race came into that community a little later, in ways that I anticipate a bit within the book, with Brexit and immigration and so on. Is that as far as we can, we need to somehow try and understand these narratives are different, and that there are additional oppressions, significant additional oppressions for those who experience racism or prejudice of any kind. But it's the narrative of struggle that is the common one, and empathy. There's a program invented by Canadians called Roots of Empathy. And it works with 5-year-olds up to older elementary age kids. It's spread all across the world now. And all they do is simply they bring into a room a baby with all kinds of kids. And then they have conversations about the baby, and who could not like a cute, cuddly baby, and who could be prejudiced against them or take umbrage against them. And it shifts people's emotions about themselves and about other people. And Adam Smith said, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, but also wrote a book about sentiments, moral sentiments, that empathy is the basic emotion of democracy. So I learned a lot about people who were oppressed in different ways than I am. And the challenge for all of us, I think, if we have in any way suffered or struggled ourselves, is not to wallow in that struggling or suffering, or to deny it, which many people who've been bullied do and then go on to bully other people later in life, but really to reach down into that suffering and struggle, to empathize, to find sources of empathy with other people's struggle and suffering.
Thanks for that, Andy. I have quite a list of questions for you. I'm not only drawing on what you've already said, but from the book itself. But I do want people who are watching along with this conversation to know that they can also, I believe, put a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
and hopefully we'll be able to get to that if they do. But we're going to come back to some of those themes again in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to go um, back to some of the early chapters of the book. And, you know, I have to say that some of them, they gave me some insight into just what I've observed working with you over the years, from your sense of humor to your incredible talent for a well-turned phrase, whether in oral or written language, to your wide interest in how you could seamlessly shift from one topic to another and in amazing ways. But some of the young Andy and the experience that you had with a teacher by the name of Miss Hindle.
Yeah.
And the chapter about that I found particularly interesting. And I'm going to ask you about one particular thing, but I have to say that when you went back and looked at the reports on your school
Mm,
from Her Majesty's Inspectorate,
yeah.
which is, you know, for a number of years in this country, we were rather enamored of the
Hmm.
inspectorate system and looked to adopting it, usually badly, in some of
Mm,
our urban school systems, particularly. But when you were in school, 1959, the report read things like um, that the teaching and learning was linked closely with children's environment and interests.
mm,
And then when you went back and looked at something from 2000, HMI report talked about well-placed lessons and productive use of time.
mm.
Very different approach. But
Yeah.
so from that period in your life, there's something that I think you're very fond of. And it's an old cracked school bell.
True. So first of all, it's important to know that probably the heyday of what we'd call progressive, child-centered, whole child education in America was probably the Kilpatrick period and the project method and John Dewey and all those things you read about in grad school. Okay, so that was the heyday. And then along came World War II, and after World War II came McCarthyism and various other things. And in in England, it never quite, for reasons that are hard to understand. Although in America there were little pockets of innovation afterwards, there's a big literature now that shows most of the innovation around maths and science actually that was a response to Sputnik didn't really take. So you get a school here like the Parkway Project in Philadelphia. You got a little network there like the Coalition for Essential Schools, but these were like small exceptions. You never saw this in a big way in state policy or in national policy as a direction. And but in England that wasn't true, I think. And really from the 1950s onwards, uh, the British tapped back into their tradition of child-centeredness and progressivism, and especially as the economy started to grow a bit, we were not distracted by Vietnam in the same way that America was, although distracted's the wrong verb actually, but very preoccupied with Vietnam, and so really the progressive approach became very widely practiced. I studied this in my PhD dissertation, so looked at the largest local authority school district in England and how it extended those methods up to kids, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. It was the inspectors were a big influence, and it was very much within their frame of mind. Not all teachers taught that way, but I was in a little primary school in a working class mill town in north of England, and the epitome of that way of approaching things was Mary Hindle. Mary Hindle taught in the school all her life. She was I always remember us wearing kind of yellow crimpling crimpline sweaters. I don't know if people wear crimpline anymore, but so she was not outrageous in any way. She became the vice principal, the deputy head. She never made head because women didn't get headships at that time, and she was a little bitter, I think, about that. She lived with the teacher next door in the class next door. So Miss Hindle and Miss Sutcliffe spent all their adult lives living together on the other side of town. And I like to think about that sometimes, and what that was for them. And she had us working in groups. We stayed in at recess to work on projects. We did a lot of creative writing linked to nature. We have 4 newspapers, so all the newspapers worked under an editor, so we did a lot of writing in relation to that. I edited the travel section, even though I only traveled in my head. I'd never been anywhere. And she was what we say now very good at understanding the whole child. She really built a relationship with the children. She understood all of them, not just the bits of them that did literacy and math. And I was not always the easiest child to teach. I think in some ways I was, because I was kind of reasonably bright and enthusiastic. But I had an exaggerated sense of social injustice that I think I had when I came out of the womb. So, I could get on my high horse and a bit sanctimonious then, as indeed I still can. Um, so I'm basically just an overgrown 7-year-old. And, I was messy. I'd forget things. If they had reports today, it would all say, can't bring books and equipment to class. Um, I was very good at smart aleck remarks, still am in some ways. Make my living off it now to a degree, and but she was pretty good at working with what people had, and not making allowances for what they didn't, and was what difficult, but also kind of taking the edge off it a bit, so you didn't get away with murder and spoil things for yourself or for other people. And isn't that what we want of all our teachers now, really, and parents, frankly? Um, and this is probably all best summarized um, by the tale of the school bell. Is that what you're alluding to?
That is what I was alluding to, yes.
So I'll have to leave here for 1 second to shut the window because the sun is coming right into my eyes.
Okay.
So can you wait for 1 minute?
While you go do that, and I'll tell people where they can find your book. How about that?
Okay, good. All right. I'll just be one.
Sounds good. Well, Andy goes and stops getting the sun on his face. I'll remind you that the name of the book is Moving, a memoir of education and social mobility. You can find it on Amazon. You can also go to the Shanker Institute website, where later you will find a recording of this conversation, and you can find there information on how to order the book. The room looks slightly less bright, so I think you've accomplished your mission, Andy.
So, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. So, so I was the bell monitor. They had all kinds of monitors. These are responsibilities for kids. So you'd have the plant monitor, you'd have the window monitor who'd open and shut the windows, and I was the bell monitor. So my job was to ring the bell when it was recess or lunchtime or whatever it might, and I took it very seriously. It's a little old handbell, and then one day I just noticed it was time to ring the bell, so I rang it, and I didn't ask anybody whether I should ring it. I was the bell monitor. What I didn't know was that something else was scheduled in the school, and so lessons were supposed to finish a bit later. So it might have been like a staff meeting or the school nurse coming to do a lice inspection, because we had a lot of that. And and so I rang the bell, and then the whole school descended into chaos. Children just started filing out of their classrooms, going into other spaces, nobody to look after them. So I was taken on one side afterwards, and a period that seemed to me at the time to last a ridiculously lengthy period of time over many days was the point was to try and get me to understand that I shouldn't have rung the bell, and that indeed I should apologize for ringing the bell when I shouldn't have. But as far as I saw it, I haven't read the literature on student voice, but I, I was the bell monitor. It was my job to ring the bell, and I rang it. Why have a dog and bark yourself? Basically, is an English phrase. So they brought my parents in. They took me to see the school principal. It was like third degree basically, and I don't know what happened eventually, but except that I never rang the bell again for a very long time until 2004. And in 2004, the school wrote to me, and it's in a poor community. I mean, it's in the 6% of the poorest zip codes in the UK. Very different kinds of kids than when I was at school. Pakistani kids, first and second generation Jehovah's Witnesses. An interesting mixture within the school. And they wrote to me and asked me, out of the blue really, would I go back and lay the foundation stone for the new building, which is frankly the nicest thing professionally I've ever been asked to do. As you said, I have big awards and honorary doctorates, but this meant so much more really. And because Mary Hindle had such an enormous inspirational effect on me, like this is why I'm here, is because I thought, this is what I'd like to do. I said, well, I'll do it if I can do it with her, because she was still alive. She'd be about 86, something like that at that point. So we both came, and it's lovely actually. There's the when you go into the school, it says a big stone, and it says this foundation stone was laid by former pupil Professor Andy Hargreaves and his teacher Mary Hindle, and that was lovely for her. So we had a big ceremony, and then they gave me a gift. And so it's all wrapped up in a little box and so on. And I opened this gift, and it was the school bell, the actual school bell that I rang and was then taken away from me and it had a little crack down the side, and there was a note with it saying, now you may ring this bell anytime, anywhere, for any purpose of your choosing. And I closed that story with some words from the late Leonard Cohen, the Canadian poet and songwriter, who wrote ring the bells while they can still ring. There is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. And so it's both a physical and metaphorical, because in a way, it's not just the bell that had a crack in it, but I did too, still do in some ways. Many people do, most of us do.
Many of us.
And it's understanding that often that the crack in things is where the interesting light gets in.
That's a beautiful story. I love that. Thanks for telling it to us. I'm going to fast forward to your preparation to be a teacher for a sec, because we actually don't have too many minutes left. And I did want to ask you about this, because most striking to me from your reflections on that period of your life and your preparation to teach was how you were kind of left to develop what in the US we would call cultural competency for teaching your students largely on your own, right? You did not know, you had to figure it out the hard way. And unfortunately, I think that's still true for a lot of teachers. So what I want to know is, Are we any better at that now in teacher preparation or professional development? Are there any good examples?
So I think certainly in a British education in the 1970s, the early 1970s, right through as far as the early 1980s, we're pretty savvy with class and economic disadvantage. So on my teaching practice, for example, I knew on this working class housing project that I had to work with their assets and not just their deficits. So the tower blocks, the huge kind of 20-odd story buildings that everybody else saw as a kind of high slum, I thought this is an asset. So I took the kids to the top, had them look down on their community, draw maps, figure out where they were, did some math. So I understood all that and we were prepared for that. But we were awful at that time in terms of any other dimension of inequality or disadvantage, race, um, gender, and of course that we weren't even aware that there was a thing called LGBTQ actually, because it was all kind of silenced and put away. And and so when I found myself in an inner city school full of what's now called the Windrush Generation, or Afro-Caribbean kids. At the time we called them West Indians. I'd had zero preparation of anything about their culture of origin and now, and the issues they face because of their race and identity, as well as economic. So I saw it mainly as uh, these were economically disadvantaged kids who happened to be black. And I only picked up things about their culture in a kind of improvised way. We really weren't prepared for it at all. Um, are we prepared for it better now? I think the answer is yes and no. So even by the mid 80s, when I was working in teacher education, I would spend a day a week with 12 students in a school. And there's a lot of children of color there, particularly Hindu children from the Indian subcontinent. And we just read a lot more. And part of the secret was whole child, which is just get to know the kids, get to know their whatever their background. I don't think you can always tick off a kid's identity and say they have this identity, therefore they're going to need this, and this. The secret is to really have that there as a reference, but then to really understand the kid in all their complexity. So I think we've got better at that in teacher education, where it is university based and where there is effective coaching and mentoring for student teachers in our schools. Where we've not progressed at all is students who go into schools without any rigorous teacher education preparation, where they might get 6 weeks over the summer, that they don't actually meet any kids, and then they're thrown in like Doctors Without Borders to a school on the front line, and often within 6 months they find they're the lead teacher in their grade level because the others have gone, basically. So in some ways we're better, we know more, but in some ways the structure in some urban school and rural school districts is worse than it used to be.
Indeed, indeed. And so let's shift gears a little from, and I take what you said about, always at the root of what's most important for teachers to do is to know the child in front of them, right? And everything that child brings, something that becomes even more challenging when you're doing that from the way you and I are talking to each other
Yeah.
right now. But I want to think at a system level for a minute, because for much of your career, and certainly the last 10, 20 years of it, you've advised a lot of political and educational leaders, whether it's at the district or LEA level, state level or national level, UK, Canada, US, Australia, more places than I know. I'd love to know if what advice has been sort of the hardest sell for you to policymakers, or if there's a time you can think of when your advice was unexpectedly taken and you didn't think
Yeah.
that would happen.
So I'll try and be briefer with this, which is not my biggest asset. Um, but the hardest advice in most systems is anything that threatens accountability. Anything that threatens accountability. And anything that will not yield a measurable result within about 4 years for which a government or a superintendent can claim credit. It's not true everywhere by any means, but I'd say in general, those are the hardest things to address. So, the late Ken Robinson, who passed away on August the 21st, found people love to hear him talk about creativity. In fact, 66 million people did, tuning into his YouTubes. But nobody wanted to implement it in any sort of sustained way, because you couldn't show after 3 years that kids are more creative than they were when you started a program. When you do have influence, it can happen directly and indirectly. So the most obvious direct one I can point out is quite recent, which is in Ontario in Canada, where we have 72 school districts and 5,000 schools. We had a Liberal government in place, led by a premier equivalent to a governor who's LGBTQ herself, a lesbian grandmother, and with a master's degree in Indigenous languages. So her agenda was very much about equity as inclusion, and also the link between achievement and well-being. And by the way, well-being isn't just socio-emotional learning. That's a massive mistake that America's making, is calling it only socio-emotional learning, because that misses physical well-being and it misses spiritual well-being, as well as cognitive and emotional well-being. And it misses the link between children's well-being and teachers' well-being.
Great point.
So I don't know whether this is a deliberate oversight, but it's definitely a systemic one that truly needs addressing. So 1/4 of her policy priority was well-being. And we worked in a seventh of the districts, 10 districts, looking at how the policy was rolling out. And I was also an advisor for the government at the time for 4 years. Myself, Michael Fullen, and one or two other people you may not know so well. And so we would do periodic reporting back about how the policy was going and so on. And at one of those meetings, which was in her office in Parliament, where there were all the secretaries of education and so on gathered around, it came my turn to give some feedback. And I gave 2 bits of, because you know how to do this, 2 bits of good news, and then the stinger. And the stinger was, I said, Premier, the great thing is you have a commitment to well-being, and it's serious. And we see you're doing lots on well-being, and it's working. And I've just described ways in which it's working. But the thing is, at the same time, you've inherited a standardized testing system that is actively creating ill-being in young children. So you are responsible for well-being, but you're also responsible for creating ill-being in young children with something that you've inherited. And I'm not telling you what to do, but what I'm asking you and your government to do is to assume moral responsibility for the overwhelming evidence that this ill-being exists because of your policy. And as a result, they thought about it. They One person cried, other people went silent, and I think a few wanted to strangle me. But a few administrators who liked the top-down control of the tests. But they then asked the 6 advisors to review the assessment strategy. We recommended several things, one of which was no standardized testing before age 11. And everything we recommended was accepted. But then, unfortunately, the government got voted out of office, and the succeeding government, Conservative government, removed it from their website and have never mentioned it again. But it's there for the future, and it will resurface at some time in the future. The other one, which is indirect, is that when we did our work on collaborative professionalism, we wanted to look at some exemplary cases. We looked at 8, we wrote about 5. And one of the ones we looked at but didn't write about because it was really too much in the early stages was Vermont. Mm-hmm. And Vermont was doing some very interesting work with accountability and quality review, where they grouped districts in groups of 3, and they'd have 2, like an inspection really, they'd have 2 review 1, and then the next year the other 2 would review the 3rd one, and so it would go over time. So it was really a policy of system peer review. And I didn't go up to Vermont. It was one of the cases I didn't go to. So my co-author went, and so I said, Michael, when you go up this time, I said, this is really interesting work. Ask them where they got the idea. Where I'd be really interested to know where they got this from. So I came back and he said, you're going to think this is very funny. And I said, what's that? And I said, well, they said they got it from you. So I was bizarrely studying myself.
Talk about unexpected.
Yeah. So and I think sometimes when it's like teachers, we've said we've had what policy wants to see is a teacher does this and the scores go up by this much within a year. Right. So you always look for the immediate policy impact, and the testing one's an example of that. But Howard Gardner's just written a terrific memoir coming out later this month that I'd really recommend people to read. And nobody's implemented multiple intelligences system-wide, but its influence on the ideas and the way they've influenced teachers and principals all over the world has been absolutely enormous. And that doesn't mean he's not had an influence because no government adopted his policy.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I often think about the influence of the work of Jim Comer, and Jim and Howard did a lot of work together once upon a time in some of the same way. It's in the ether without necessarily being in the policy document. I cannot believe that we have been chatting for an hour already. It's flown by, but I'm not going to let you escape without a quick answer to one last question.
Which is?
The last question is, you mentioned that you get asked a lot why you wrote the book, why you wrote Moving. But I want to know, who'd you write it for? For yourself as a reflection, as a legacy for your family, for educators, for social justice activists? Who'd you write it for?
Yes, is the answer, but not all at once. So it really began. It really began. There's a section in the book which talks about my mum dying, and me writing a piece about her as she was dying in hospital, unconscious, for the local paper, and in writing that, I realized for the first time that there was something here. And of course, I wasn't writing about me, I was writing about her. So there was something here in writing about people like her. And then I got lots of letters back from readers of the newspaper and family, friends, colleagues. And so the book began as really wanting to write about the culture and life of ordinary people, and give it dignity without false nostalgia. So also talk about the warts, the racism, the prejudice of the xenophobia of working class communities. It's all there, as well as the loyalty, the hard work, and so on, just like it is in a lot of America now. Um, and and so it began really by wanting to write about that. But then, of course, the more I got into it, it began to become personal. In some ways cathartic, in some ways difficult. So there are sections in there talking about what it was like when my dad died. There's sections about fights with the local gangs and homophobic insults, because I was a kind of thin, wiry kid. And I could play sports and so on, but I was a thin, wiry kid and the only one going to school on the opposite side of town. So there's things you tuck away for a long time that when you bring them back, it's important to confront them for yourself, so that actually I think you can help other people confront them. But at first it was just like, it became a long rambling account of everything for my entire life. And clearly too much. So I put a limit on it at age 22, which was the time I left university. That gave it some focus. And what was originally one chapter, which was about high school and going to school on one side of town and living on the other, and trying to hold together these two lives, which I've been trying to do all my life, by the way. I've spent a lot of my life bringing together uh, people who other people want to keep apart, or ideas that other people want to keep apart. And I work hard to kind of integrate, because really it's probably a personal integration as well as a professional integration. That then became the theme of the whole book. And I've had other people write to me. I've got one colleague who's started writing an autobiography, but because I've done mine, but is struggling and doesn't know what it's about. And I said, well, you'll find what it's about in the middle of it. You probably won't know what it's about at the beginning, but the process of writing is exploration for yourself, and also exploration of in what ways can this narrative be of value to other people personally, to be cathartic for them, and to other people professionally, in terms of thinking what they can do in their work and their systems to improve the opportunities and experiences for the millions of people like who don't look like me often, but in other ways are like me, because they're trying to work with moving on up at all, and then once they're moving on up, trying to do it in a way that is psychologically integrated, not psychologically disruptive.
Thanks so much, Andy. We are going to have to end it there. And again, the book is called Moving, a Memoir of Educational and Social Mobility. And I have to say that in reading it and in hearing you talk about your life and your mom particularly, and I think of what I read every day about what's happening in the world during this pandemic, and I think that the line between ordinary and extraordinary is very blurry sometimes.
Yeah.
It's a great read, and we really appreciate everything you do in the world for education, your service on the Shanker Institute board. So lots of gratitude from AFT and the Shanker Institute and myself and Leo for having this conversation. And until we talk again.
Thanks, Marla. Thanks to the Shanker Institute, who I'm very proud to be associated with, for hosting this event and bringing 35 participants together. We've lost 4 now, but 35 participants together to be part of it. And anybody who reads the book, if it evokes things about yourself or about your work, please feel free to write to me, and I'll say something. I may not say a lot, but at least I'll say something.
That's a deal. Thank you so much for saying that, Andy.
Yeah.
And thanks to everyone who joined in.
All the best. Yeah. Bye
Take
bye,
care.
Marla.
Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.